We're on the Mishnah at the bottom of Chav Chesam at Beis. Lo yomar adam letabach shkoli bediner basar aval shochet umachalik beinehem. Continuing along our discussion, in not engaging in weekday activity, uvda dechol on Yantif, even when making purchases for the Yantif meal, a person should not say to the butcher or to the shochet, they're used interchangeably, you know what, I need a certain amount of meat. Give me a dinar's worth of meat. Give me $10 worth of meat. You shouldn't stipulate a monetary value. Aval shochet umachalek beinehem. But what you can do is you can say, I'll take a percentage of the animal. Give me half, give me a quarter, give me a third of the animal. That's what you're allowed to do. So the Gemara now asks Heichi Yavid, and Rashi explains the question of Heichi Yavid, of what should you do, is really predicated on the assumption that it's not always practical to say, give me half an animal. What if I only want a pound of beef, So the question is, what do you do when you need less than a half an animal or even less than a quarter of an animal? How do you say it? So, kiha de besura amri, tarta upalgu, the besura amri, tarta upalgu tarta, benorash amri, chalka upalgu chalka, bepumpadisa amri, uzya upalga uzya, benahar pekod, uvemasmachasya amri, riva upalga riva. So Rashi explains that the Gemara is basically describing that in different regions in the Middle East, they have different names for a certain kind of cut of meat. That there was a standard cut in different places, and you could say, I'd like a piece. It was basically a word that you would say for a piece that was a standard cut. That all the butchers knew that if you said that word, like in Surah, if you said, give me a tarta of meat, they knew exactly what you were talking about. It was a certain cut, a certain size, or you could say, give me a half a tarta. And a tarta was more approximate to a provision for an individual or two individuals. So therefore, that would be an easier way. But because you're talking about the size of the piece or the cut of the piece, and you're not talking about its monetary value, therefore it's permitted. Let's go on to the next Mishnah.
Can you specify the front, the back, or like dark meat, white meat, or kind of thing?
Well, that's a good question. It would seem that the Mishnah doesn't limit as far as what cut. If you want to say, give me the shoulder, and we're going to actually talk about that later on. We'll talk about you are allowed to specify what part of the animal you would like, as long as you don't specify its value. So, and also we're going to see later on that you're not allowed to specify the weight either. Okay? We'll see that later. Let's take a look at the Mishnah. Omer Adam lechaveira, malei li kalize avalo b'mida. And Rabbi Yehuda Omer, im haya kli shel mida lo yimalenu. It's a bit vague as to what this machlokis is, and so it's going to be the subject of a debate. But the simple words translate as that Tanakama says, you're allowed to say to the vendor, to the merchant, you can say, fill me this vessel, but you cannot specify the volume, the actual measurement. And Rabbi Yehuda says, if it is a measuring vessel, like a measuring cup, then you cannot fill it up even without specifying the measurement. So the Gemara is going to explain what exactly the machlokis is. Just hold on. And let me just also explain that the convention in those days is that the vendor did not provide you with a plastic CRV, what is it, is that what it called? CRV, PVC, whatever it was. He didn't give you a 2-liter bottle together with your Coca-Cola or your olive oil. Or there was no glass containers either. The vendor stored things in his containers. You brought your container to the vendor, and then he would pour from his container into your container. So when you bring a container to the merchant, you cannot say, fill it up and say, here's a liter container, give me a liter of goods. And that's what the Tanakama says. Rabbi Yehuda says, if the container that you bring him is a measuring container, then even without specifying, it can't be used. More will explain this further. Maisa ba'abashol ben botnes shahim amali midosav me'erev yom tov v'nosna lalokuchos b'yom tov. Abishol ben Botnis was makbid that, despite the discussion that we had a moment ago, he would never fill up containers on Yantif at all. And he always only filled up the containers from before Yantif, and the Gemara will explain why. Abishol Omer Af B'Moed Osakain, and the Gra and the Bach take out the next few words. Rashi is equivocal as to whether those next words are in, but we're going to learn it without those words, and you'll see why later. That he says even on Chol HaMoed, it's appropriate to not fill up containers. In other words, there's a compelling reason, which we're going to see later on, why it's important not to fill up containers, not only on Yontif itself, forget about the issue of measuring, but there's another compelling issue as well, so that even on Chol HaMoed, you shouldn't do it. And v'chachamim omrim af b'chol osakain b'pnei mitzoi hamidos. And the chachamim say, forget about Yontif, forget even about Chol HaMoed, but even on a weekday, that's not Yontif at all. You should never fill up the buyer's containers on the spot. And the reason is because of mitzoi hamidos. And what that means is that when the consumer brings in his container, if you pour out quickly from the merchant's container into the purchaser's container, you're never going to get out the full amount. If the buyer says, I'd like a liter of olive oil, and the merchant has a liter in his container, by pouring out the liter, you're going to end up with 0.99 liters. You won't end up with a full liter. Because olive oil, and the same thing is true with other fluids, adhere to the walls of the container. And so in order to guarantee that the consumer will get the best bang for his buck, they'll get the real measurement, it's important for the buyer to leave his container with the merchant overnight for an extended period of time. The merchant then pours out the oil and leaves it hanging over the buyer's container overnight and lets it flow out for the entire time. And that way, you're ensured to get almost every drop, but as much as possible. The Gemara now says, "My avolo b'mida." So now let's clarify this machlokas, the first part. What does it mean that you can't use a measuring cup, or you can't specify the measure? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel avolo b'kli hamiyuchad lamida, aval kli ha'omed lamida yamal enu. So Shmuel holds that the Tanakama is not talking about verbalizing at all. But what he's talking about is that you're only allowed to use a container that has never been used before for measuring. It's okay if it's designated for future measuring, but if it's been used in the past for a measuring cup, you cannot use it on Yontif. If it is a measuring cup that holds exactly a liter and that you made it for that purpose, for measuring, if it's never been used before, you can use it for the first time on Yontif. That's what the Tanakama is coming to say. V'asa Rabbi Yehuda l'meimar afilu kli ha'omed l'mida lo yamal enu. And Rabbi Yehuda argues and he says, no, even if it was made for measuring, because it was made exactly to be like 1 liter, then you're not allowed to use it on Yontif at all, even if it's never been used in the past. So,
with the malacha that...
It's not a malacha at all. It's uvda dechol, like we've been talking about all along in this whole parak, is not talking about malacha. It's talking about the Yisur D'Rabbanan of uvda dechol, behaving in a mercantile fashion on Yontif. Okay? So, Alma Gabi Simchas Yontif Reb Yehuda L'chumra V'Rabbanan L'kula. So what do you see from here? You see that it seems that when a person is interested in having Simchas Yontif, and whether or not the Chazal choose to indulge such a person, we have to. There's a tension, right? On the one hand, we want a yid to have Simchas Yontif. On the other hand, we have to restrict his mercantile activity. So therefore, there's a tension, and we see that Reb Yehuda is more machmir, and he says you can't even use a vessel that's never been used before. And the Chachamim are more lenient and say if it's never been used before, even if it's made for measuring, you're allowed to use it. So frak the Gemara v'ha'ib chashamina lahu. But yesterday in the Mishnah, we just learned the opposite. The Chachamim are more machmir, and Rabbi Yehuda is the lenient party. Ditznan Rabbi Yehuda omer shokal adam basar keneged hakli keneged hakoifetz, v'Chachamim omer meimashkichin bekaf maznaim kol ikar. Alma Rabbi Yehuda lekula v'Rabbanan lechumra. Kasha de Rabbi Yehuda, Kasha de Rabbanan de Rabbanan. So look at yesterday's Mishnah. What was the case? Using a balance scale. Rabbi Yehuda says it's okay to use a balance scale, provided that the counterweight that you use to weigh the meat on the other side of the scale is not the regular weight, but rather a butcher's cleaver or some other abnormal utensil. And the Chachamim say, no, you can't use a balance scale at all. So we see that the Chachamim are the Machmir party and Rabbi Yehuda is the Mekel. And over here, the Chachamim are the Mekel, and they allow you to use a measuring cup as long as it's never been used before. And Rabbi Yehuda is the Machmir, and he says, no, if it's meant for measuring, you can't use it. So how are you going to reconcile that? So the Gemara says like this: the Rabbi Yehuda lo kasha, hasam b'sheina omid lamida, hacha ba'omid lamida. So Rabbi Yehuda will tell you like this: the reason why I'm lenient when it comes to using the balance scale is because you're doing it with a shinoi. You're using an item that is abnormal, and that's why it's okay to do it on Yantiv. But over here, you're using a standard measuring cup, and that's why I'm machmir. And derabanan nami lo kasha, hasam ka'avid keda'avdin b'chol, hachalo ka'avid keda'avdin b'chol. And the Rabbanan will tell you, it's also not a stira for us. When you're using the balance scale, you're using a scale that is used during the week, and that's what we object to. But over here, since you've never used this measuring cup before, you can't call this a weekday activity because it's never been used during the weekday. And therefore, we can justify its use. You understand? That's the Chachamim's argument. So basically, the Gemara is saying it's apples and oranges. The Chachamim look at it one way. Rabbi Yehuda looks at it a different way. Rava Omar, so that's the opinion according to Shmuel as to what they're arguing about. Remember, according to Shmuel, the machlokis in our Mishnah is whether you can use a measuring cup that's never been used before and you want to use it for the first time on Yantiv. Okay? Rava Omar, Rava says, I disagree. That's not the machlokis in the Mishnah, but it is as follows. My avolo b'mida shelo yizkor lo shem mida, avol kli hamiyuchad lemida yamal enu. The topic of the Mishnah is about verbalization. It's about what you're allowed to say and what you're not allowed to say. The Chachamim say that as long as you're allowed to use a measuring cup, as long as you don't specify, give me a liter of oil. You just say fill her up, right? That's all you're allowed to say. And va'asa Rabbi Yehuda l'meimar kliyam yuchal amida lo yamalenu. Rabbi Yehuda says you can't use a measuring cup, period, regardless of what you say or don't say. So al magabi simchas yantav Rabbi Yehuda l'chumra v'rabbanan l'kula. So we're going to ask the exact same question. We're going to go through the very same back and forth. We see from our Mishnah that the Chachamim are Mekel and Rabbi Yehuda is Machmir. V'ha'ibcha shaminan lahudit nan Rabbi Yehuda omer shokalad nebasar keneged ha'klicha neged ha'koifetz v'chachamim omer me'mashkichin mekach b'maznayim kol ikar alma Rabbi Yehuda l'kula v'rabbanan l'chumra kasha de Rabbi Yehuda kasha de Rabbanan d'Rabbanan. So, but what about yesterday's Mishnah, where the case of the balance scale, Rabbi Yehuda was lenient to let you use the balance scale as long as you do it with the shinoi, and the Chachamim said you can't use a balance scale at all. So you see, yesterday's Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda is the Mekel and the Chachamim are the Machmir, just the opposite of this Mishnah. So how do you reconcile it? The Rabbi Yehuda lo kasha, hasam v'she'ena miyuchad lamida, hacha miyuchad lamida. So it's a very similar answer that we just gave a moment ago. Rabbi Yehuda will tell you, look, the balance scale, you're using it in a method where the item that you're using as the counterbalance is not specified for weighing things. And therefore it's okay because you're using a shinoi of a non-standard measuring tool. Okay? But over here, since the measuring cup is designated for that purpose, it's a standard measuring cup, that's what I object to. And the Rabbanan nami lo kasha, hasam ka'avid keda'avdin b'chol, hachalo ka'avid keda'avdin b'chol. And the Rabbanan will tell you, the reason why we're makel over here and we're machmir in the previous Mishnah is because in the previous Mishnah you're doing a weighing in the same way that you do during the week. You're using a balance scale, and over here you're not doing it in the way that you do it during the week, because during the week when you want to buy a liter of oil, you tell the guy, give me a liter of oil, right? And don't argue, well, you're using a measuring cup, so that's a weekday activity. No, because many times there are many times when you use a measuring cup even when it's not engaged in mercantile activity. Because quite often, when you want to present your friend with some wine, you'll just put it in a container. And even if it is a measuring cup, you'll still use it as a gift. So therefore, just because you're using a measuring cup does not indicate that you're doing a mercantile uvda d'chol, because people use measuring cups for non-mercantile activity also. And therefore, it's only indicated that it's an uvda d'chol if you actually verbalize that you want a liter, right? You want a specific measured amount.
Based on that, you can't say they really make all by Yontif, because It's only because that people use that cup for
right.
other
So
uses.
it's not a question of the Chachamim are always Mekel and the Rabbi Yehuda is always Machmir or vice versa. They look at different considerations for Rabbi Yehuda. Let's say analyzing it according to Rava. For Rabbi Yehuda, it's the tool that you use. If you're using it in the standard fashion, it's aser, and if you do it with a shinoi, then it's okay. The Chachamim say, no, that's not the criterion. The criterion is how you speak on Yantiv. If you can use the standard tool, as long as the way you verbalize the interaction is done in a non-mercantile fashion. So it's not a chumrah or kula. It's what the different considerations. Okay. Maisa ba'Abishol ben Batnas. Let's look at the story of Abishol ben Batnas, who made sure that he always pre-measured things from before Yantif and would always make sure that he would fill up the measures before Yantif. In other words, customers would it seems like that he wouldn't measure out anything on Yantif itself. He would make sure that he would measure everything for his customers before Yantif, and he would then present it to his customers on Yantif. So Tana af b'moed osakain mipnei bittul beis hamedrash, and the Brisa then says that according to Abishol, you should do this on Chol HaMoed as well. And why should you do this on Chol HaMoed? Is it really wrong to measure things on Chol HaMoed? No. However, there's a concern here. Abishol was a big Talmud Chacham. And if you look at Rashi, he says something fascinating. He says, in those days, they didn't do it like we do today. What do we do on Chol HaMoed? We go on a tiyul, we'll go to Disneyland, we'll go to wherever we want to go, right? In the times of the Gemara, there was no Disneyland. If you had time off from work, you went to the Beis Medrash. That was your recreation. So during the rest of the year, people didn't have time to sit in the Beis Medrash. They were busy working. So during Chol HaMoed, they went to the Beis Medrash, and Abba Shol was a big posek. He was a Shol Umeishiv in the Beis Medrash, and he didn't want to take away time from sitting and answering people's shilas in the Beis Medrash. So therefore, even though he was a merchant, he actually worked for a living, right? So even though he had to make a parnasa, he made sure not to take away any time on Chol HaMoed to engage in his business. He minimized the time that he would have to take away time from the Beis Medrash, so he wouldn't take away time from answering people's shilas. So therefore, he filled up all of his customers' containers from before Yantiv to maximize his time in the Beis Medrash. That's the reason why it's better, because you're going to have to, it takes away more time if you have to wait to fill up everyone's container on Chol HaMoed itself.
This would be customer containers, not his own.
Well, no, his containers, it seems that way, because remember, the standard is the customer comes with his own container. So it's very time consuming to transfer from the vendor's containers into the customer's containers. So he would ask his customers, bring your container before Yantif, even if you only need it on Chol HaMoed, and the night before, I'll fill it up. He didn't have a problem necessarily of filling up the containers on Chol HaMoed, but he didn't do it during the daytime. He did it the night before. Okay. And Tanu Rabbanan, hu kana shalosh meos garvei yayin meberurei hamidos, b'chaverav kansu shalosh meos garvei shemen mimitzui hamidos. Now, let's just explain, as we explained in the Mishnah, we talked about mitzui hamidos, which is with oil, that it's appropriate even during the week, according to the Chachamim, to pour out from the merchant's containers from the night before and let it continue pouring out all night. The same thing is true with wine. You want to let wine settle when you pour into the buyer's containers because of the froth that accumulates at the top of the wine. You don't want, if a customer gives you a liter container to fill it up, and you just fill it up without waiting for the froth to go down, like when you went to the movies and you told the guy, give me just a little bit of ice, and then they would fill it up with ice 3/4 of the way, and then they'd let the foam go up to the top, so you were left with about a half an ounce of soda at the bottom of the cup, and you paid $7 for that. Or in my days it was maybe only $3, right? But so the thing is that that's the way they learn how to jip you, right? So the Gemara understands that concept. The Gemara says you can't rip off the customer, and the only thing is that there has to be a certain acceptance of the customer that even despite the best of intentions and despite the waiting for an extended period of time to let the liquid drip out of the merchant's containers, there's always going to be a little bit of loss such that the customer is not going to get the full amount. And the Gemara tells us that Abba Shaul was able to accumulate 300 barrels of wine that he calculated that he had shortchanged his customers over a certain, we don't know how long this period of time was, maybe it was over years, that even despite his best intentions of filling up their containers the night before, nevertheless, he figured because of the adhering of the liquid to my container, I've shortchanged a whole bunch of customers. I got 300 barrels of wine, and I don't know what to do with them, of leftover wine. That's not mine. And his colleagues had accumulated 300 barrels of oil in the same way. And they didn't know what to do with it. They didn't want to keep it because they were very righteous. So ve'ivim lifnei gizbarim liYerushalayim. And they brought them to the treasurers in Yerushalayim. They didn't want to make it hektish because you're not supposed to take stolen goods and just make it hektish, right? They didn't want to do that. So amru lahem iatem zukukim lakach. So the gizbarim, the treasurers, the rabbis in Yerushalayim said to them, Rabbi, we appreciate the gesture, but you're putter because the buyer is moichel at some point. And you have to realize this is not stolen. The buyer is moichel, and so don't worry about it. Take it home and enjoy it. So Amru lahem af anu ein ritzonenu bekach. They said, no, we don't feel right keeping it. So Amru lahem hol vehechmartem al atzmechem asu mehem tzorchei rabim. So they said to them, well, if you want to be machmir, then and you want to treat it as if it's not yours, and you want to know what to do with it, then do public works with it. Detanya gazal ve'eni yodei lemi gazal yasa bahem tzorchei rabim. As the Brisa says that if you inadvertently stole from the public, and you don't know who it is you stole from, because let's say you were a merchant and you have scales that are off. So you ended up shortchanging your customers, and you don't know which customers you ripped off. So how do you rectify it? So you should do tzorchei rabim, you should do public works for the community with that money.
If you really felt that way.
One second. Ma'ininu, so what are those public works? Amar Rav Chisda, boro shichenu ma'aras. You're supposed to pay for public waterworks. And public waterworks back then was digging cisterns, reservoirs, and things like that. What?
Paving the roads.
Paving the roads could be today, right? That would be the thing to do with it, yeah.
If you really felt that way, why wouldn't you have to pay a chomish?
Well, because it's
Pay a chomish?
the chomesh is for asham gazelles when you have to bring a korban. When there's no korban, you don't bring a chomesh. This is now, we're dealing with post-Churban issues here. So there's no...
They really felt it was some type of aspect of Gezel.
Well, I'm sure they knew that they were Michael. They just didn't want to have it.
They knew they were moichel. They felt wrong. They felt wrong benefiting from it. So Adbere Rav Chisda l'Rav Neukva v'Dorash. So Rav Chisda is spatziring with Rav Neukva, and he's speaking to him and learning, and he tells him as follows: Lo yimdod adam sa'orim v'yitim lifnei behemto b'yom tov, aval koder hu kavo kabayim v'nosin lifnei behemto ve'eno choshesh. That on Yantif, we restrict your ability to measure, even if you're not measuring for a customer, but you're just measuring grain for your own animal. If you have a measuring cup to measure how much to give your animal for his feed, you're not allowed to use that on Yantif in the normal fashion, which is normally to pour into the measuring cup. But what you can do is go over to a pile of grain in your barn and use it as a scoop to just scoop it out of the pile of grain and give it to your animal that way. Furthermore, if you're a chef or you're a cook and you're cooking on Yontif, we do allow you to measure the spices, because you could really ruin the food if you don't have the ability to measure how much spice you need to put in the food.
So we restrict it because we're worried about that carrying forward to mercantile?
That's right. That's exactly the issue. But there are certain leniencies, because if you stand to ruin what you're cooking on Yantiv, there the Chachamim gave a consideration. Amar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba Amar Rav Modedes Isha Kemach B'Yom Tov V'Nosenes L'Soch Isasa Kedei Shetitol Chala B'Ayin Yafa. So Rav Yirmiyah says that when a woman is baking a dough on Yantiv, we allow her to measure the flour. And the reason is because, when you take challah, it's supposed to be 1/24th of the dough, is what you're supposed to take. If we don't allow a woman to measure the flour, we're worried that she's going to miscalculate and she's going to underestimate the amount of flour that she uses, because we're worried that she's going to be stingy with taking challah. But if we allow her to measure, then she'll take challah with the proper percentages and take the proper tithe. Ushmuel Amar Aser. And Shmuel says you're not allowed to measure flour, even though your intentions are for challah. So v'hatana devei Shmuel mutter. But Shmuel had a compilation of mishnayos that he taught in his Beis Medrash, and he cited a brisa which says that a woman is allowed to measure flour. So how could he paskin that it's aser? So Amar Aryai hashta da Amar Shmuel aser v'tana devei Shmuel mutter. Shmuel halacha l'maisa asala shmuina. The very fact that Shmuel is almost like contradicting himself. He's got a brisa that he's taught in Shir that says that it's mutter, but he paskins to people that it's aser, means that Shmuel is trying to tell us as follows. Technically it's permitted, but we don't want to publicize this psak, which means that if someone comes to us and asks us, is it okay to do this, we tell them no. But if we see someone doing it, we don't protest, because technically they're within their rights. And the reason why Shmuel didn't want to paskin that it was mutter is because he felt it would result in abuse, and people would just measure willy-nilly, and that would lead to mercantile activity. Tanu Rabbana, Ein shonin kemach b'yom tov. The brisa now says that you're not allowed to re-sift already sifted flour on Yontif. Now, to sift flour on Yontif for the first time, everyone agrees is aser. That's an act of miraked. You're separating the chaff from the flour, and that we don't allow you to do even on Yontif, because it was something that you should have done from before Yontif. But if it's already sifted, and you want to re-sift it right before you bake it so that it'll be nice and fluffy or whatever, right? That we also don't allow you to do, even though you're not separating anything. But Mishum Rabbi Papias Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Amru Shonin. These two Tanoim say that it's permitted. V'shavin she'im nafal l'sochan tzaror o kisem sheshonin. And everyone agrees in this brisa that if a foreign element, like some wood or some pebbles, fall into the flour on Yontif, then you're allowed to re-sift it on Yontif. Tani Tana Kamei de Ravina. Ein shonin kemach b'yom tov aval nafal tzaror kisem borer biyada. A brisa was taught before Ravina that's different from this brisa. And this brisa said that you're not allowed to re-sift flour on Yontif, and if a foreign element falls in on Yontif, then even then you're not allowed to re-sift it with a sieve, but you have to pull out the foreign elements with your hand. So Amrlei kol shkein da'asr dahavalei keborer. And Ravina remarked on that. He says, I don't think that makes any sense. He says that's even more problematic to pull it out with your hands, because then you're doing the standard borer of psolas mitoch ochel. You're pulling out the bad from the good, which is the standard method of borer. At least when you're sifting, people can see that there's nothing really that's coming out of it. There's no real separation of chaff from wheat. So therefore, that's not the normal way of being borer. It's perhaps also not as labor intensive, and therefore it makes a lot more sense, says Ravina, to allow you to sift, just to re-sift it, instead of pulling out the foreign element by hand. Darash Rava bar Rav Huna Zuti apischa denahar da. So this rabbi, his name is Rava bar Rav Huna Zuti. I'm not familiar with this appellation of Zuti. Maybe it's Rava bar Huna the lesser. It sounds like, maybe to distinguish him from a different Rava bar Rav Huna. And he was teaching at the doorway of Nahar Da, Shonin Kemach b'Yom Tov, that you're allowed to re-sift flour on Yontif, like we had seen in the name of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira and Rabbi Papias. So Amrluhu Rav Nachman Puko v'imru leila Abba Shkila Toivosecha v'Shadi Achizri Puk Chazi Kama Muhulta Hadran b'Nahar Da. So Rav Nachman sort of gave a backhanded scoff to that statement of this Rava bar Rav Huna. He says, you think that guy's such a big favor he's done for us. And that the term that the Gemara uses, if you haven't done me any favors, is your kindness is thrust upon the thorns. You haven't done anything. You think you did such a big favor by informing us that it's mutter to resift flour on Yantif? Go out and look in Naharda and see how many sieves you find on Yantif. Every woman is already resifting her flour. So you haven't told us anything that we don't already know. So the visu de Rav Yosef nahala kimcha agabe demult. Despite Rav Nachman's cavalier dismissal, we nevertheless find examples of people who were machmir. So the wife of Rav Yosef, she once was resifting the flour, but she did it with a shinoi. So she turned the sieve upside down and sifted it upside down. So because she wanted to show that it's not something that we should do lechatchila on yantiv in the regular way. So Amar La Chazida Anarifta Ma'al Yasa Ba'ina. So Rav Yosef gave her gentle musar, and he says, "Wife, don't do a shinoi. I want the best quality bread on yantiv." So he was very mekel because of Simchas yantiv, and he said, "No, sift it normally." But the visu de Ravashi nahala kimcha agaba de pisora, and Amar Ravashi hadidan brati de Rami Barchama. So Ravashi's wife also used the shinoi when she would resift the flour. She did it on the table, and it's not clear exactly. Rashi says that there was a certain kind of table that had drawers in it, and so she would take out a drawer, and it sounds like she would turn it upside down and use that as the surface for the sieve, the flour to fall out. Tosfos says she just did it on the table. It's not clear. The Rambam uses the same language, but it's not clear. But anyway, she did it with a shinoi. Instead of using a regular trough, she did it on a different kind of surface. So Ravashi remarked, and he says, "Listen, my wife comes from a very distinguished home. Her father was Rami Bar Chama. For Rami Bar Chama, Mara Du'uvdahava, he was very meticulous in everything that he did. V'lav dechazi mibei nasha lo hava avda. And had she not seen her father do this in her father's home, she wouldn't have made up the chumrah on her own. Not like some of the girls that go to seminary and they come back and they tell their parents the whole house is treif, right? He says, my wife is a very frum lady because she grew up with it in her home. If she hadn't seen her mother or father do this at home, she wouldn't be being machmir like this. And therefore I have to respect her minhag, right? Mishnah. Holech adam eitzel chen v'ni haragel etzlo v'omer lo tein li beitzim ve'egozim b'minyan shekein derech balabayis lios mona b'soch beisa. The next Mishnah says, as I mentioned, I foreshadowed this before, a person is allowed to go to a merchant on Yantiv, haragel etzlo, meaning that you know the guy, and therefore he's prepared to give you goods, on credit, and you'll cheshbon ois later on after Yantiv, and you could say to him, give me so many eggs or so many nuts. And the reason why that's mutter is because that's not definitively mercantile activity. Because even in your own home, you count out a dozen eggs or half a dozen eggs. So just by asking the merchant to give me please give me a dozen eggs, is not by definition a mercantile kind of behavior. The Gemara now says, Tana Rabbana, you're allowed to go to a shepherd on Yantif and say, please sir, give me a goat or give me a sheep. And you can go Eitzel Tabach Harogel Etzlo V'Omerlo Tainli Kafachas O Yerach Echas. And that goes to Alan's issue. You can go to the butcher on Yantif and say, please sir, give me the shoulder or give me the thigh. Eitzel Patam Harogel Etzlo V'Omerlo Tainli Tor Echad O Gozel Echad. You can go to a bird cultivator. I don't know what, there must be some special term for a guy who raises birds.
A poultry fattener.
A poultry fattener. Lovely. I think Art School just made up that term, right? What is it? A guy who runs a hatchery? I don't know. Whatever. And you can say to him and say, please sir, give me one pigeon or one dove. And you can go Eitzel Nachtam Aragel Etzlo V'Amrlo Tainli Kikar Echad O Gluska Echas. You can go to a baker and say, sir, please give me a roll or a loaf. Or the Eitzel Chenvini Aragel Etzlo V'Amrlo Tainli Estrim Beitzim V'Chamisha Megozim Asara Farsikim V'Chamisha Rimonim V'Esrog Echad. You go to a merchant. You can say to him, please sir, give me 20 eggs or 50 nuts or 10 peaches or 5 pomegranates or 1 esrog. all different kinds of examples of how people would typically want to pick up and use these different types of produce. The only thing you're not allowed to do is use a volume or weight kind of specification. You can't say, give me a bushel of nuts. You can't say, give me a pound of peanuts or something like that. Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Omer Levad shelo yaskul sikum mekach, and he also adds that you're also not allowed to mention a monetary value. You can't say, give me $5 worth of eggs or $5 worth of peaches or things like that. And we'll continue Mir Hashem tomorrow.